reminders for some, new for others, on the potential role of electrification in decarbonization and meeting state and national obligations to mitigate climate change, and then dive into analysis. What would a cold snap like the one in January look like after all the buildings are electrified? And then, given that the key word in that electrification definition is strategic, what would it actually mean to, in light of the implications of a peak event like this, what does that actually mean about the kind of questions discussion that we would need to settle to really make a plan about what electrification should look like across the country? So just a reminder, for those of you who live in a state pictured on this graph, you may remember 3 weeks ago it was very cold. For those calling in from further afield, you were probably warmer than we were. But basically across 2 days, Wednesday the 30th and Thursday the 31st, it was very cold. What air that would normally have been sort of trapped near the pole was released to come south and join us. You see here that it was in the high -20s in the upper Midwest, a little warmer in the Northeast, but still very cold compared to even a typical winter cold snap in the Northeast. So you might imagine that this had put some stress on the heating requirements of all the buildings across these states. So as far as the gas system is concerned, most of these buildings are heated with gas. January 30th, which was the Wednesday, had the record highest total daily gas consumption for the U.S. as a daily basis ever, and it was the 3rd highest day for residential and commercial gas consumption ever. The gas system was generally pretty reliable in this context, although in several places either hardware failures or just sort of concerns about capacity did lead to some events. In Minnesota, Xcel, the utility there, asked customers to set their thermostats to 63 rather than warmer, so that their heat demand would be a little bit lower. Also, in a stress situation like this, even single failures can lead to loss of service or other requests to curtail demand. In this polar vortex event in Michigan, there was a compressor station fire from Consumers Energy on the morning of Wednesday, the day before the temperatures I just showed you. But that resulted in concerns about lack of pressure and capacity in the gas system, and both the utility and the governor asked customers to turn down their thermostats in response. During the previous cold snap in the Northeast, all of 9 days earlier, there was a frozen valve, likely in Weymouth, Massachusetts, that resulted in a low pressure event that cut off gas service to about 7,000 customers in Rhode Island. So when the system is operating at its limits, things that might ordinarily would have been enough gas left in the line to get to the end of the line in Rhode Island, but everybody was pulling their pieces off, right? So there was a low pressure event that resulted in people getting a little cold in Rhode Island. The electric system also is stressed by cold like this, partly because there's a lot of gas power plants, and so there's competition for limited gas capacity between building heat and power plants. You see here in the chart the spot prices for natural gas from the EIA. The Northeast is in blue and the Midwest is in orange. Across these days, the spot prices, which are the prices basically the electric power plants have to pay to buy gas, and also that the gas companies might need to pay if they need to go above the capacity that they've otherwise secured, spiked on these days. So it's an indication of, given supply-demand balance, that there was a lot of demand for gas, competition between these sectors. DTE, the electric utility in Michigan, asked its customers to reduce electric consumption because it would reduce stress on the gas plants and the gas system, right? These systems are highly related to each other. Of course, just pure cold also has some effects. A nuclear plant in New Jersey went offline because its cooling water intake froze over. It actually couldn't get the cooling water in that it needed. However, generally the electric system was quite reliable. I think there have been several of these polar vortex events over the last half dozen years or so, and the grid operators have gotten a good sense of how to plan for them. The various pay-for-performance type structures have been set up in the regional markets. have set up, help PJM and MISO know how to deal with these kinds of things. The Senior Director of System Operations at PJM said they had ample resources and plenty of reserves throughout the whole event. Generally, solar performed well during the event. It was clear and cold. Solar performs well when the panels are kept cold and when the sun is shining. The days aren't as long in January as they might be otherwise, but otherwise solar actually performed pretty well. And reports on wind performance are mixed. It was windy, so you saw the wind chills on that that initial chart. So there was plenty of wind resource, but some wind generation actually had to shut down because it got below the temperatures that the equipment was actually designed to operate at. Thinking a little bit more generally about cold events, polar vortexes, and planning for the future, just to share here are some results from analysis that we did here at Synapse in support of the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources in their comprehensive energy plan that was released last year. We looked at the weather from the February 2015 polar vortex and what the regional electric grid in the Northeast would look like on a day like that in both 2022 and 2025 as different resources change and as the population grows, et cetera, in the Northeast. One thing that really came out clear in that analysis is actually that even today there's a lot more gas pipeline capacity into New England than there was in 2015. You see here on the chart there's a difference between 2018 and 2015 that even if an event like the 2015 event happened in 2018, and in fact it did just happen in 2019, that there's just a lot more capacity, and so the reliability issues, winter fuel security, et cetera, are a lot less acute in the Northeast than they were even a few years ago. Looking forward to 2025, when the Massachusetts large hydroelectric imports and the offshore wind resources that are being procured by state policies come online, so that much more resource that doesn't depend on natural gas that's available on peak and can really result in not even less concern about electric system and gas system reliability in the context of extreme cold. So this gives you some sense of a little bit of how the energy sector might go about in practice and in planning and dealing with cold days. So I introduce the other side of this. We did the polar vortex side. Here's the Electrify Everything side of things. So as we think about what it means to deeply decarbonize the energy sector, we developed this graphic for our report that we did for NEEP a couple of years ago about strategic electrification. It basically boiled down to the 4 things you need to cost-effectively go about strategic electrification and deep decarbonization are low-carbon energy supplies, energy efficiency, flexibility, and electrification. And we identified the overlap area between efficiency and electrification as the key area to focus on for what we call strategic electrification. There has been this sort of rallying cry for electrify everything, and as we think about what that means, we want to think about how to do that in the smartest possible fashion. For NEEP, we define strategic electrification as that overlap between efficiency, flexibility, and electrification, but as part of a comprehensive plan for deep decarbonization. So dealing with understanding what's going on seasonally and hour by hour and a peak weather event would be part of such a comprehensive plan for deep decarbonization, so you really understand what all the issues are that you're raising. Our work for the Northeast isn't the only one that has identified electrification as a key path towards deep decarbonization. The U.S. Mid-Century Strategy for Deep Decarbonization, which was filed by the Obama administration in the waning days of its second term in November of 2016. The place you find this is on the website of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the U.S. part of the U.S. filing for its compliance with the Paris Agreement. We have not absolutely, fully, completely pulled out, and this document has not been rescinded. This is actually the closest thing we have in the country to a plan for what getting to 80% reduction by 2050 actually looks like across all sectors, including a really interesting in-depth analysis of the forest sector and land use and all sorts of other things in this plan. But if we look at just at the energy sector, we see that the electric demand nearly doubles between 2005 and 2050. The electric share of each of the other sectors grows substantially. Building sector gas use and oil use fall by half or more. Transportation electrifies substantially. Industry electrifies substantially. So if this is the direction that we're on, and the best analysis out there indicates that if you're really serious about hitting our commitments to the Paris Agreement and to fighting climate change, it's going to involve a lot of electrification. So we need to think of that much more about what that actually means. When we looked at a month-by-month basis in the report that we did for NEEP, which I mentioned before a couple of years ago, you break down this butterfly graph, as we call it, where winter impacts are not that great for the first few years as the markets really ramp up, but that by the time you've nearly electrified all the buildings in the Northeast, December, January, February total electric consumption is substantially higher than today's summer load. In fact, January passes August sometime in the mid-2030s as energy efficiency pushing down on the summer peak and electrification pushing up on the winter load. So you end up with needing to think about where a whole lot of winter clean electricity comes from, for example. When we released this, one of the questions we got at the release event was, oh, did you take climate change into account in terms of 2050 being warmer than today? And the answer is no. We didn't have a good model for exactly how much warmer and be able to take that into account. But one of the things about thinking about what climate change means for this is to say, well, maybe in the future we wouldn't have polar vortex events either that are quite as intense as this one. And in fact, evidence indicates, or people are trying to get the exact causality, but evidence indicates actually that it's the other way around. That a warmer Arctic is more likely to let go of its air and let its air come diving south, perhaps, than it would if we had a colder climate in general. So even though on a monthly basis we took climate change into account, you might have less extra load needed in January and February. Your peak events might be just as acute, and in fact maybe even more regular.
Question, Asa. These monthly shapes look like they're for buildings, or they're labeled for buildings and transport, but what is most pronounced there is that winter change, right? Which must be the heating load in buildings. And is transport just a smaller amount of electrification, or is it spread out, or kind of what's going on with this graph and the transportation side?
Right. So the transportation load. If you look nationally at electrification, transportation would be a much larger relative impact. But because it's as cold here as it is, right, you see that much more impact from the winter weather than you would if you were looking at the same calculations for North Carolina or California. But the other thing that is happening, transportation is in here, and there are transportation electric use is the compensating effects. Transportation and electric consumption from EVs is somewhat higher in the winter because the cars are slightly less efficient when they're cold. But also people drive more in the summer than they do in the winter. So there's somewhat compensating effects in terms of seasonality, and that being not a terribly strong seasonal effect, especially when compared to the buildings effect.
Thanks.
So if we're going to try to look at what peaks mean, like what does that actually mean when you try to think about a polar vortex type event coming across the northern tier of the country, we want to get a handle on what's really going on in the buildings. And so what we've done here, and we're sort of transitioning into the concrete analysis presented here today for the first time, is really breaking into sort of home by home, how much electricity would it take to keep each of these homes warm over the course of an event like this. So to do that, we use what's called the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, or RECS, which is performed by the EIA every few years. The most recent one is from 2015. But critically, what EIA releases is anonymized microdata on the 5,686 homes that they include in their sample. So they weight each one about how representative it is of some number of additional homes. If you work it out, that basically each home is sort of standing in for about 20,000 other homes. So there are about 30 of them in Boston, right? There are several hundred in New York City, right? But Montana might only have 30, right, across the whole state. But they got a whole lot of data about exactly what's in each home. They have the energy bills from each home. They have the characterization of each building, how big it is. And they've run a lot of statistics on that and come out with an estimation of how much of each home's energy consumption was for which end use. So there's a chart here of residential electricity consumption by end use from this sample, across air conditioning, space heating, water heating, et cetera. And this is the national average number, breaking it down to, they're advertising this figure about how many new end uses they were able to do in the 2015 sample to really break out microwaves and pool pumps and all of the rest. But critically, the space heating energy use estimates for this sample allow us to get a sense of just how efficient and how much energy does it actually take to heat building by building by building across each of these states. So we look at this area, which is sort of the path of the storm. Ignore Ontario for a moment. But there's this nice overlap, which is helpful for analysis, between the path of the storm, 4 regional transmission organizations or independent system operators, MISO, PJM, New York ISO, and ISO New England, that basically data from those 4 is a pretty good proxy for the load that would be affected by the storm that came along that path. And then the dashed line identifies the edges of the census divisions that EIA REX data is on. They don't tell you where each house is. They just tell you which census division it's in, not even which state it's in. But roughly speaking, there are houses in our sample from Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, but there are relatively few of those compared to the rest. And so we have you can use this nice overlap between the storm path, where the electric grid information is available, and where the household information from REX is available to give us a good hook into where how to think about all these pieces interacting. So we basically said, well, what happens if the 39 million of those houses across those census divisions who heat with something other than electricity today all got cold climate heat pumps with electric resistance backup heat that was able to provide enough heat to keep the building temperature constant through an event like the polar vortex. So for scale, there's 48 million households total. We're only changing heating systems in 39 million of them because there's 9 million across this area who already heat with electricity, and we're just going to leave them alone for the purposes of this analysis. We give everybody a cold climate heat pump, but we realize that cold climate heat pumps themselves don't do as well when it's -10 as they would when it's 30, because they're trying to suck heat out of that much colder air. So we have real performance data about how ducted and ductless heat pumps perform in very cold temperatures, and we just assumed that when the temperature was below -15, that the coefficient of performance, the level of efficiency of the heat pumps, was 1. That basically, that every kilowatt hour of electricity that went in would produce 1 kilowatt hour of heat in the home. That basically, if folks have electric resistance backup, that's what they're getting, or a heat pump running is basically just heating with its own internal resistance, is about able to be able to deliver that, but not more. Because we're working off the REX sample for this analysis, we didn't do the same kind of thing for commercial buildings, although I think it's likely possible. So we just took a sort of total load of commercial buildings and said, well, the residential buildings are doing X, then we'll do the same thing proportionally to commercial buildings to get a sense of what that looks like. Load shapes may be different, et cetera, but load shapes for the heating load are basically determined by the outdoor temperature. And so that's the same for the commercial buildings as the residential buildings. We also didn't try to electrify anything else for this analysis. We didn't say that folks also had electric water heaters, although in a deep decarbonization context they probably would, or electric vehicle load. In the context of this weather, there was relatively little driving. People were asked to stay home, so maybe EV load is less of an issue than it might have been, regardless. So we then looked at It identified a set of proxy cities sort of along the path of the storm to account for what the weather was like piece by piece along the way. So that was going from west east to Minneapolis, Chicago, Columbus, Philly, Poughkeepsie, New York, and Worcester, Mass. Sort of follow the path of the storm. And then and looked, in particular, you could figure out how much below the design temperature for these heating systems are they actually running. On average, they're running about 15 degrees lower than the design temperature for heating systems, so we need to be able to take that kind of building science heat loads into account. You put all that together, you get a substantial additional heating load. The dotted lines here are the temperatures on the right axis for 3 of those cities, and then the blue is the actual load across those 4 RTOs, and the orange is the additional load from heating. So the peak moment is about 8 a.m. on Thursday morning, the 31st, which was actually the peak moment on the grid as it was today, but it's a much sharper and higher peak with the heating load as well. It happened, and it's not surprising that the heating load might be highest just before dawn. It's coldest then, but that's also the time of the morning ramp on a morning peak on a winter electric system. So you might think that actually it'd be pretty common for the overlapping peaks of an event like this to happen right at 8 a.m. Now, if the storm had gone through about 4 hours faster, you can see on the temperature lines here that Minneapolis, Columbus started heating really fast just after that point. I think Chicago was about 40 or 50 degrees warmer within 30 hours at the end of the event, right? And so if the storm had been about 4 hours ahead, you might realize it had quite a different shape, where the peak would have come in the middle of the night rather than exactly overlapping with the morning peak. But just for a sense of scale, the blue line peaks at about 280 gigawatts at that time, and the combined load is about 600, so it's a little more than a factor of 2 increase in electric load for that hour compared to today. So it's a pretty substantial increase. However, go to the title of the next slide, don't panic. A doubled load, this is the case in which you take today's technology and you deploy it overnight in today's building. So one thing we know is that building shells will be better in the future, both because the existing buildings will get retrofit, some of them, along the way, and also because new buildings will be built to better code and better performance than the buildings that they're either supplementing or replacing. So even a 15% improvement in the average performance of buildings will be worth more than 45 gigawatts at that peak moment, which is a lot of avoided capacity. Also, heat pump performance, we expect will get better over time. Heat pump performance during normal operation at 10, 20, 30 degrees would be very welcome, but as far as the peak is concerned, it really matters what heat pump performance is at the low end of its range. But even if all those heat pumps, if we really were able to run heat pumps with coefficients of performance greater than 1 through this whole process, and if you had a coefficient of performance of 1.5 for those lowest temperatures, that would be worth 90 gigawatts of avoided capacity in an hour. Also, there are behavioral responses. The sort of ad hoc gas system demand response that was done in this event is about, you could imagine doing something comparable where you ask folks to turn their thermostats down 5 degrees. So 5 degrees on the thermostat is worth about 20 gigawatts of load across these areas.
Question, Asa, on these numbers, is this for the peak for the 4 RTOs combined?
Yes. Right.
And I think you mentioned, you're talking about buildings, but you mentioned transportation and EVs. What is the assumption again for EVs?
This didn't include EVs or water heaters. This is just a space heat calculation. So, right, these are things that pull the numbers down. If you have people also taking hot showers and charging their cars during this period, you see the other way. Now, EVs, at least you could get people to charge them up slightly different times, maybe ahead of the storm, right? People might want to do that for their own comfort anyway. maybe get people to controllable water heaters that are not designed to not run exactly on those peaks. So maybe those kind of controllable loads wouldn't really add to this peak calculation anyway, or not as much as they might otherwise. The other thing, of course, that you could do is to have dual fuel heating systems. So you could have, when folks here in the Northeast install a ductless mini-split system on an oil-heated home, they retain their oil-heated system. They can run it when it's super cold, and the ductless system then doesn't act to peak. But the ductless system can displace 60, 80, 90% of their fossil fuel use. So they're deeply decarbonizing, but not 100% decarbonizing. But it could have really profound impacts for what's actually going on at the moment of peak on the grid. So it depends a lot. What's going on the peak depends a lot on whether you think that people are retaining some sort of capacity to burn a fuel in their homes and not pull on the grid during that peak moment.
And if the fuel that they retained for the winter peaks were natural gas instead of oil, how would that? That's more of a mixed bag, right? There are pros and cons of both of those fuels. We'll talk about some of the implications for infrastructure and such coming up. Natural gas tends to be cheaper. More people have it already. They can keep their existing systems, add heat pumps to them. But there are also there are real infrastructure implications for that wouldn't be true for something like oil or propane. The other thing, of course, is that we're not actually going to do an overnight electrification. It's going to take some time to do this. If you imagine doing all of the, electrifying as much as you're going to electrify, 80, 90, even 100% of buildings by 2050, that's 31 years from now. For scale, electric generating capacity in the U.S. increased by a factor of 3 over 40 years from 1970 to 2010. So doubling over 30 years, is a return to substantial growth. But is not something that's unprecedented or otherwise in terms of the capacity of the electric system generally to move a lot of electricity. It works out to doubling over 30 years is a little more than 2% per year load growth. That's actually not an incredibly fast rate of load growth in terms of growth in peak. There's a question of also transitioning all of the generation, providing all of that electricity at the same time. Right? You have to be able to lock and chew up to be able to make all of this actually work. The other thing about it is that this is primarily a regional issue across the Northern Plains, Midwest, and Northeast. One, it doesn't tend to have polar vortices in Florida or California, right? So the depth of the cold is different. Also, the northern states are where there's more fuel oil. There's older building stock that doesn't tend to be quite as efficient. So that regional focus means that we're not actually talking about doubling peak across the country so much as doubling peak in these areas, right? And what does it mean to think about that limited scope? So as we think about making a plan for accomplishing a transition like this that will actually works, does reasonably cost-effective things along the way, there is this question, right? We've modeled here a case in which we basically focused on what happens if you electrify the buildings that are the most fossil fuel intensive buildings in the country, roughly speaking, the ones that are where it's coldest, right? So generally speaking, a question like we're going to direct your attention. Do you direct it, in the classic sense of why do you rob banks? Well, it's because where the money is, right? If you're trying to reduce carbon emissions, you go after these homes, which are the highest emitting homes generally in the country. Alternatively, if you're really worried about the infrastructure impact of electrifying those buildings and meeting meeting comfort needs in those buildings, maybe it's better to start at the other end of the distribution, right? And electrify, build markets and whatever, electrify the smaller homes and the more southerly ones, and build the market in to the Northeast. So, I think there are good arguments to be made on either side. It depends on whether you're more concerned about trying to touch as few buildings as possible. If your real barrier is getting a homeowner to make a decision to proceed, you want to get them over that hurdle as few times as possible. The 11 million homes in the country that use 40%
of the fossil fuel used for space heating. If you could just get those 11 million homes, you would get a long ways towards meeting greenhouse gas targets, but those are the ones that have the biggest impact on the grid. The deepest retrofits may be necessary, other things that are hardest to do about that. So it's interesting challenge back and forth about how to figure out where to start. So all I'm going to do for the rest of this presentation is illuminate various questions in the hopes that someone out there will be interested in joining us in exploring them. These are all things that if we produce them, I hope you will find them more interesting. If other people produce them, we will definitely find them interesting. The kinds of analyses that I think would be real useful and interesting to advance the overall conversation about what does it mean to strategically electrify the building sector.
There's a question, Asa, about the for the 4 RTOs that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Just to clarify again what they are. We're going.
Yeah.
I think we had a map back.
Yeah. Let's go back to the map. So these are the 4 people the organizations that run the transmission system across at the New England, the green through Mid-Continent ISO, the salmon color, PJM, and New York ISO in between. So these are the folks responsible fundamentally for keeping the transmission system running, dispatching generators, et cetera, across that swath of space.
Mm-hmm. And they do worry about things like unusual loads and unusual weather, but they probably are not currently planning for extreme electrification.
Right.
Would that be the case?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think they're planning to meet the blue curve on this chart, which is unusually high for winter, and they're concerned about making sure that all the power plants are ready and reserves are there in case the tree falls on a line in the storm and all those pieces. But I don't think anyone is yet planning for the orange curve. They have some time, thankfully, as you mentioned, to plan for the orange curve. But if the states in the country are serious about decarbonization, that winter peak is coming, and they could start to plan for it. So, speaking of power supply and dispatch and transmission, there's a question of thinking on the power supply side. How do you match supply and demand? Where does all this low carbon electricity come from to meet this much higher load? How can you be sure you're going to get it in these kinds of weather conditions? Storage, obviously, is a big part of the question of how to do that. The figure on the right is one from a report that Wood Mackenzie put out, I think, yesterday, where they said, well, what if you tried to meet today's polar vortex situation with a grid that was half solar, half wind, and a bunch of batteries? How many batteries would you need? What does it mean to do a sort of no hydro, no nuclear, but a wind and solar only plus batteries version of handling the polar vortex? They didn't say, well, what if all the buildings were electrified at the same time? So there's the next level of the question. But they did a first cut at, to meet a 280 gigawatt peak, you need about 200 gigawatts of batteries. There's a question of, how over what duration do you need the batteries? It depends on sort of how much solar are you needing to shove around in the weather pattern that comes through. Also raises an interesting question, you mentioned along the way, like we didn't include the EV load. So the question is, like, if everybody has an EV also, maybe all those EV batteries are actually a key resource to help the grid get through this kind of circumstance. If a 60 kilowatt battery were available for the home to use, that would keep a typical home in these weather conditions warm for 4 or 6 hours. And in the warmer parts of the storm, maybe even longer than that. And so, maybe that kind of sort of vehicular demand response, if everybody has an EV and parked at home, you might actually be able to get quite a lot out of that EV load if you had it set up to actually be able to provide energy, not necessarily all the way to the grid, but at least to the home to run a heating system. Okay. There's this other question about whether it makes sense, is necessary, versus batteries essentially to maintain gas plants, to use them occasionally, right, to maintain the infrastructure and such, run them, have them on sort of spinning reserve ready to go, could even use renewable natural gas potentially. Generally, the difference in meeting our emission targets between 100% carbon-free and 98% carbon-free is not that great. And that 2% might be really valuable. Maybe that's actually, versus marginal amounts of storage, maybe that's a more flexible, different kind of resource, and you'd want to analyze that. We mentioned RTOs and wholesale folks thinking about planning for events like this in a decarbonized world. Also, just plan to think about what wholesale market design, capacity markets, other things might look like to be able to, in the context of, a lot of these organizations are going through analyses now where they're thinking about putting a price on carbon in the wholesale markets, or whether capacity markets work with state-supported resources and other, they're doing wholesale market redesign. You might want to make sure that that process is sort of winter aware, is aware of decarbonization impact, and that the markets aren't going to be redesigned again in a few years if this load really starts to show up. There's a general question about how much to use the electric grid and how much to maintain dual fuel heating capabilities. We talked about this a few minutes ago. If the utilities really built out an electric grid, a transmission distribution system that could serve that load twice as high as current peaks, is the load factor of that infrastructure good? Is that really bad for rates? If we use that infrastructure really well the rest of the year for other things, maybe that doesn't have a really sharp rate impact. If you have to build a whole lot of infrastructure in order to use it for 5 hours every 2 years, that's a lot of cost potentially to bear for that grid expansion. At the same time, if you're going to have folks maintain a dual fuel heating capability in their homes, does that mean maintaining the entire gas distribution system, which you might not otherwise need? Right? So you can either expand the electric infrastructure a lot, or keep the gas infrastructure you're barely using. Neither of those are necessarily all that appealing. There's the other option of actually having on-site fuel storage. That a propane tank is effectively a very large battery. Probably what you're going to use it for is heat. You can buy for about $1,000. You could get a propane space heater and a propane tank installed in a house, right? And then say, well, I'm just going to need this very occasionally, and I'm going to disconnect off of the electric grid or off the gas grid. I won't have really high peaks when they want to charge me an arm and a leg for capacity at this winter peaking time. Maybe that makes sense. You got to worry about indoor air quality, a really tight home, burning a space heater. There are all sorts of things you got to work those through. But one time $1,000 for infrastructure for the home times all of these homes, times 39 million homes, or keep the gas infrastructure to do the same thing
on the utility side.
On the utility side on their books, right? Different kinds of things. It might depend. The answer might depend on what kind of buildings we're talking about. We're talking about new buildings that are built to be tight and able to have pretty low demand through a storm like this. Or we're talking about older buildings. Also, the difference between Minnesota and Massachusetts, both cold. In Minnesota is that much colder. The difference between minus 27 and minus 2 might make a real difference in what the right outcome is in terms of how efficient different technologies are, how long storms might last, et cetera. So a whole lot of different things to try to take into account. And one last set of questions, if we're thinking about the nitty-gritty of implementation of, say you're running an electric energy efficiency program, you're designing demand response, or thinking about what the future rates might look like, you also want to think about what this kind of event, how what you're doing, helps or hurts in these kinds of contexts. So, for example, avoided capacity and avoided T&D costs could be a really big value source when thinking about cost-benefit analysis of an efficiency or demand response measure that would really be able to shave gigawatts off of a winter peak. Also, for those folks looking at doing R&D or trying to pull cutting-edge technologies into the market, remember that even an extra 0.5 coefficient of performance, an extra little bit of efficiency in the coldest temperatures is worth an awful lot in terms of impacts on the rest of the energy system. And also for the gas demand response side, there are sort of informal ad hoc gas demand response events in these polar vortex events where you sort of put out a public appeal. Well, maybe we want to think about what is a more, obviously in a fully electrified system that this stuff stops becoming an issue, but in the meantime, maybe more formal gas demand response systems around, what does it mean to ask people to change thermostats or otherwise change industrial processes and things to be able to make sure that the capacity is really there.
So one question. So this is we're talking about issues that are kind of big in terms of the broad chunk of the country, that maybe a third of the country, or
right.
And there's an issue around who kind of at what geographic scale can you do what? So there, the ISOs have a role,
right.
But smaller than that, it seems like state energy offices. There's a state policy role, and a utility scale, system scale role, and then also probably a national role for DOE and NERC and people like that, right?
Right. Yeah. So these questions, have implications for all different kinds of players. From folks who are going home, talking to a homeowner about who is interested in future-proofing their home and decarbonizing their home, right? Should those folks be advising that homeowner to keep their backup heating system? Right? It'd be good to give them guidance at some point about whether that's an important thing in the long haul for them to be able to do or not. All the way up, as you said, to DOE doing R&D development on next generation heat pumps. And utilities thinking about grid planning, for their distribution systems and rate design for a customer. It's like each of those different scales has an implication for the states who are pushing, who have Massachusetts has an 80% by 2050 Global Warming Solutions Act, right? What does that mean for state policy around making they've already changed the rules this year on the energy efficiency programs to include electrification. So, they're pushing that forward, but that has implications then for the rest of the system that only needs to sort of move and respond and amplify those signals. So, it goes from the smallest scale, from the homeowner planning how to decarbonize their own home, all the way up to the macro scale of generation planning. Folks who have an idea of how you're going to get low-carbon electricity at scale on peak in January and February, right? Market opportunity, right? Sort of piece by piece by piece through each of these.
And with regard to utility resource planning, which is one of the scales, right. What's your sense of whether and to what extent utilities in this region are kind of asking these questions or taking this seriously with regard to their resource planning?
Well, I guess the question of resource, what we mean by resource planning is, because these are all restructured contexts, right? There's wholesale markets running across all these areas. In many cases, but not all cases, the utilities are the wires utility is separated from the power supply. So there's a wholesale market design side of that, and there's a sort of retail wires design utility side of that. The wholesale markets, as we talked about, I think are not yet wrestling with this. They have nearer-term fish to fry. Some of the wires utilities, I think, are starting to think about this, and I think they see opportunities for load growth. They see opportunities for rate mitigation. You have utilities in Vermont offering heat pumps and batteries to customers. National Grid has their 80 by 50 plan, where they lay out the first steps of this, predominantly around transportation electrification. They're also a gas company, so they're sort of torn, I think, about how to think about what to do about the building side of it. I think utilities are starting to needle at it. I think they're really interested in electrification, predominantly about transportation. But I guess I would argue that electrification of buildings needs to be on their radar screen, particularly across this colder swath of the country.
Thanks, Asa. Another question just came in is whether you're aware of different players, states, utilities, efficiency program providers, who are talking with propane providers about on-site fuel along with heat pump installation. So you mentioned propane backup. Is there anything going on with regard to that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. I'd love to hear about it. I know that the propane industry is very we're actually pretty well organized and connected, and national associations and such. I think there's a question about what the business model too for a propane provider whose job it is to service a system that's barely used, right? It doesn't sell a whole lot of fuel. Like there's a business model question for what this looks like for the providers of those fuels as well. But I'm not aware of anybody who has yet really jumped in with what that looks like. I will say that there was an interesting dynamic, it's somewhat anecdotal, in Vermont, where a gas pipeline was being expanded, and the delivered fuel providers were, in that particular context, supportive of heat pumps, because a customer who would install a heat pump on, to supplement their fuel oil or propane, remains a fuel oil or propane customer. It doesn't switch to natural gas. And so there's this three-way competition thing going on between delivered fuel, gas, and electricity, and you might find strange bedfellows in those contexts.
Thanks. So I think we're going to wind down. Do you have any final comments, Asa? Or
yeah, just that I think all this stuff is really interesting. I hope that we and others get a chance to really investigate these questions, and we can follow up with further analysis downstream and help advance the conversation on this topic.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Asa, and everyone else. This was recorded and it'll be posted, I think, in the next day or two. If you do have follow-up questions that occur to you, feel free to shoot them to webinar@synapse-energy.com, and we'll field them when we get around to it.
And you can just email me directly. I love to talk about it.
Email Asa, and if you learn of any interesting research or studies that are done, we'd like to know about them. And then also mark your calendars for March 21st at 2. We'll be back with a webinar talking about grid mod and benefit cost analysis. Thanks, everyone.